All right, folks, we're going to get started here. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Hilary Fouts to give our next talk. Dr. Fouts is an associate professor in family and child studies at the University of Tennessee. Before joining the University of Tennessee, Dr. Fouts spent 4 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the National Institute of Child Health and Development, working on social emotional development. Dr. Fouts' research focuses primarily on child rearing practices in diverse cultural and socioeconomic contexts. She attempts to understand the role of ecological, biological, and cultural factors in infants and children's experiences and interactions with multiple caregivers, including mothers, fathers, siblings, extended kin, and formal child care providers. Drawing on these research interests, Dr. Fouts has worked predominantly in underrepresented cultural and socioeconomic contexts, both internationally and in the United States. She's worked with small-scale semi-nomadic foragers in the rainforests of the Central African Republic, the Republic of Congo, and her work in Central Africa and Congo is focused on toddlers and young children and the various care they receive from various caregivers. Since 2001, she's been engaging in research in the U.S., working with families in diverse SES contexts and with diverse ethnic heritages. So it's our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Fouts to the University of Notre Dame. Thanks.
Am I on? Okay, I'm on. I will try. I have a very loud voice, so I will try not to blast us out. Although hearing myself echoing, I'm already a little loud. Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. This talk and then the next one following me, Robin and I were just saying, we're going to take you to a very different part of the world than the previous talks, although I think this is very relevant to the kinds of things that we've been talking about already in terms of cultural and community contexts, especially variety of caregivers. And I'm going to talk particularly about something that instead of choosing a topic that I had already done a ton of work on, I instead chose to do a topic that was fresh and exciting to me. So what the data I'll be presenting to you is still preliminary and very exploratory. So hopefully your questions will also give me some more ideas on how to approach this. But this is what I basically am trying to accomplish today. One, I want to explore and talk about the importance of transitions in siblinghood in terms of becoming an older sibling as it's relative to child flourishing by looking at trends in research and theory. And then considering some of the cultural, biological, and social ecological features that surround these transitions in siblings, and from a rather holistic perspective, talk about how some of these things can be considered in research, and then provide a perspective by looking at some of my existing data from Central Africa and Congo with the Aka and Bofi foragers or hunter-gatherers. So in terms of sibling transitions, oftentimes in the sibling transition literature, the focus is really on the arrival of a new infant sibling and whether or not the child that has just been displaced is upset by this. Do they enjoy the child? Is there conflict around that? But really the transition begins a lot earlier in pregnancy. And I have this picture up here. This is 3 Aka women in the Congo, and we were actually engaged in a net hunt, and they were taking a fruit break here. You can see the fruit, so we're taking a sort of a snack break. And the woman in the middle is pregnant, and so is the woman who has the sling on your right there. And her child is starting this transition to siblinghood from being the youngest child to being in about 5 months not being the youngest child anymore. And this transition for that little girl will be marked by many different things, including right now she is still carried along, she's sleeping there, she's still carried along on net hunts, and she's going to go through a transition that will change how much her mother spends time with her and who takes care of her. And so we also have, as part of this transition to becoming an older sibling, the arrival of the new sibling. And this is also one of my Congo pictures. And this is just a few days after the birth of a new sibling here. And you can see this is the formerly youngest child who has just undergone this transition or involved dramatically in this transition right now. And I mean, I didn't have them pose at all. I was lucky enough to get the next oldest child looking sort of inquisitively over, with interest it seems, over the new baby. And then you can see the oldest sibling is sort of comforting and holding close the youngest, the next to youngest, the formerly youngest child. So in terms of looking at siblinghood transitions and the transition from being the youngest child to no longer being the youngest child, it's really important to note that this is a normative transition that most children in many parts of the world experience. I was sort of laughing as I was putting together some of this particular slide as I was putting together my materials, thinking that although I cannot tell you that I've experienced this because I am in fact a youngest child, but many, many people do experience this transition of being displaced from the youngest child and becoming an older sibling. However, even though this is such a normative transition, for many, many years, there's been this prevalent assumption among developmental researchers, theorists, clinicians, and physicians that becoming an older sibling is stressful or difficult in some way for children and for parents. And even historically, the psychoanalysts had depicted this transition as being one of the most traumatic experiences of early childhood. And most of the current research on sibling transitions have presumably due to this assumption or assumptions like this, have used family crisis and stressful life event perspectives to look at how children fare through this transition. And also in the popular literature and parenting books, it's a very common topic to lend advice on how to help children through this transition, again with the assumption that children need help because it's a difficult time. So is it really safe, though, to assume that becoming an older sibling is stressful? Now, in terms of trends in the siblinghood research, and I'm really not overstating this, but most all of the research looking at this transition is from white middle-class families in the US and Europe. There's extremely limited information on sibling transitions in other contexts or other parts of the world. In fact, myself and my grad student have been scouring the literature and also and only found 2 studies, both by the same author, in Japan as the only non-US or non-European sample at all to look at this transition. So this is widely looked at as from a Western standpoint. Likewise, in Volling's systematic review in 2012, those were the only studies that she found as well that were anywhere outside of the US or Europe. The other thing is that most all of the studies focus just on mothers, exclusively on mothers, in terms of the assumption that this is a transition that is between that youngest child and the mother. She did find, Volling did find in her 2012 systematic review that 20% of the studies out there on sibling transitions did include fathers, but none that I have found have included any other caregivers than mothers and sometimes fathers. And most studies also are firstborn children. And this makes sense, as firstborn children are not just becoming an older sibling, they're also just becoming a sibling. So arguably they may have a more dramatic experience in terms of that transition versus later born children that are a sibling but being displaced by as the youngest sibling. So there are some common trends, even if we look at the limitations of this body of literature, there are some common trends, and it does seem that in most studies show that there are changes in mother-child interactions after the birth of a new sibling. And typically, what most studies have found is that maternal involvement and warmth tends to decrease across the transition or to be lower after the birth of a new sibling, and punitive and restrictive behavior tends to increase or be higher. Both these are from cross-sectional as well as longitudinal studies. Of the very limited studies with fathers, there seems to be some evidence that having a warm and involved father may lower the stress or the conflict that children experience during the transition. But in terms of how children actually fare, there's really no common theme. There are some children who show no behavioral changes whatsoever across the transition, There are some children who show sort of positive things in terms of developmental growth, and there are some children in studies that are showing higher stress or conflict during the transition. So in terms of what children actually experience, it's a pretty wide range. And it is important to note in all of the studies out there, there is considerable variation in terms of individual family and child patterns that could be explaining some of this variation. So most of the literature is all focused on this more child development and family sciences perspective, and especially from a family stress perspective. But there is some relevance in terms of if we look at evolutionary theory, although these theories haven't been applied to this particular issue. But if we look at parental investment theory, and it's particularly parent-offspring conflict theory, that is working under the assumption that parents have limited energy, and if any of you are parents out there, you realize that you have limited energy, and what you invest in one child, you cannot invest equally in the other child, that there are trade-offs. And if you have one child that you are investing a tremendous amount in, I'm thinking, Lee, you have a new baby now, and so there's a lot that goes into it. If another baby was to arrive at this moment, you wouldn't be, I shouldn't even, that's not even funny for a new parent, I'm sorry, it's too much, it's too much. You would be limited in your capacity to how much you can give to each child because you only have so much time and energy. And so there are trade-offs between what parents face in terms of investment in current versus future offspring. And during pregnancy and after the arrival of a new baby, there's expected to be a shift in the allocation of investment in that there should be, especially when we're talking about mothers, there would be expected to be a decrease in the current offspring in favor of providing investment to this new infant that has all kinds of needs and is particularly vulnerable. And parent-offspring conflict theory would suggest that, well, it does suggest that children resist any decrease in investment, that children are adapted to extract as much investment from their parents as possible, and that this enhances their ability to survive and enhances their reproductive success. And therefore, if you think about pregnancy and sibling transitions, some of this should also be playing out as well if we look at it from an evolutionary standpoint. And it also brings to light the sibling competition in that if children are trying to extract as much investment as they can from parents, and Trivers uses this world, he refers to it as psychological weapons, that children use these psychological weapons, and he actually, his example that he talks about in that early 1974 article is of the weanling child using psychological weapons to get the parent to want to help them more because of the loss of the investment of breastfeeding being such a powerful and important investment. So, but if you think about if children are all trying to extract as much investment to benefit themselves, that siblings may be in competition for this limited resource of investment. And so, so the sibling transition time can also be thought of as a time that could involve some sibling competition for parental investment. The other perspective coming out of neo-evolutionary theories that I think is relevant, but it isn't as specific to sibling transitions, is in Hawks and colleagues' grandmother hypothesis. Now, they've mostly this is specific to Hadza grandmothers, but they've found that grandmothers provide particular support to families at key times, and they do mention that this key time in terms of, and they're really looking at the evolution of postmenopausal lifespans, but they talk about the importance of why it's a key time for grandmothers to be investing in children, in their grandchildren. During when the mother is pregnant or has a new infant, and these are times where the child who is the toddler age child is very vulnerable in terms of because of the provisioning that is decreasing. They are usually a recently weaned child, which sets them up for other a host of other health risks as well, and that this key time is when grandmothers are important. So there is some information to suggest that from a new evolutionary standpoint that it's not just about mothers, but that there is this competition for investment that also may be going on, and that siblings and grandmothers in particular may be involved in this process. Now, a cultural perspective, this has been mentioned, culture and community has been mentioned a lot for the last 2 days, and I really appreciated that. But one of the issues is that with sibling transitions, there really hasn't been, as with new evolutionary, a cultural perspective actually applied to the issue, although I think there are plenty that are relevant. And the one that I think is particularly relevant in terms of providing guidance to what one might look at in terms of trying to gain a cultural perspective of sibling transitions is Super and Harkness's developmental niche, because they point out the various things that you should look at if you want to understand how culture structures the environment in which children are developing. And so they talk about how it's important to look at the social and physical settings around the child, as well as the cultural childcare practices and the psychology of caregivers, also sometimes called parental ethnotheories. I'm going to refer to this as the cultural models of child development. And so when we're talking about culture here, I know the word gets passed around a lot in terms of that culture is important, but as an anthropologist, I think of as culture as those beliefs and practices that are shared by a group and that are integrated, that are an integrated set of behaviors and practices and knowledge and beliefs that the group shares together, and how that structures child development. And so this is a way to get a sense of some of that, that cultural landscape in which this transition is going on. And certainly transitions in siblinghood, like any developmental transition, is embedded within these contexts. Okay, so what I want to do in terms of looking at some of the data from Central Africa among the hunter-gatherers is sort of, I set about to sort of explore how I might sort of document at the very least some of the things Super and Harkness are talking about, but also being informed by this neo-evolutionary lens, as well as the work being done in more child development and family studies, which is difficult when you have a transdisciplinary perspective because you can't study everything. But I thought that some initial questions using data that aren't ideal to answer all of the questions about sibling transitions, but are available and quite unique in terms of the context because so little has been documented in any non-US or European context. So the first thing I want to look at in terms of the data is what are ACA and Bofi Forager cultural models related to transitions to older siblinghood. I did speak with, this is based on long-term ethnographic work with the ACA and the Bofi, and I did talk with them about sibling transitions quite a bit because I spent many years looking at breastfeeding and weaning transitions, and part of the weaning transition is mothers becoming pregnant and new siblings arriving. So I did specifically talk with them about what children think of pregnancy and how they reacted to their pregnancy and what happens after the new baby arrives and all of these kinds of things. So I'll share with you some of the qualitative data from that. And then we'll look at using cross-sectional data, but looking at infants who are at different stages in the sibling transition process. So children who have mothers who are not pregnant and are still the youngest child, children whose mothers are pregnant and still the youngest child, and then children who have recently been displaced as the youngest child and have a new infant sibling, and looking at how this coincides with different patterns in caregiving and social experiences, as well as the children's behavior at these various contexts, focusing on distress and conflict-related behaviors. I'm not measuring stress, and I didn't collect cortisol. This is all behavioral. But looking at their fussing and their crying and things that are typically related to that, as well as some of their more positive social behaviors in terms of interacting with, smiling, laughing, and playing with other people. So I'm going to just go really quickly. I don't want to bore you with all the methods, but what's important to know is that this is based on about 25 months of ethnographic fieldwork and long-term focal child observation. So each child was observed for a total of 12 hours on 3 different days. So these aren't huge samples, it's only 58 families, but what we do know is we have a lot of information about each child in terms of their typical daily experiences. So we have covered daylight hours from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., although that has been randomized on 3 different days. And these are, the quantitative observations are 30-second on the mark, which equals to 1,080 observation points per child. And then extensive demographic interviews with the entire community, as well as the parents of the focal children, and then the qualitative interviews that I've already mentioned. But again, we're going to look at data from these 58 families who had children between the ages of 1.5 and 4 years, and among the Aka and the Bofi. The Bofi live in the Central African Republic, and I'll show you that on the next map, and the Aka foragers in the Republic of Congo. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those populations, as you may or may not be familiar with them. But this is where the field sites are. So even though they're in 2 different countries, and the Aka and the Bofi foragers have different cultural names and speak different languages, they are very, very similar culturally, and they both live deep in the rainforest, but they are, there is this national border here, but in the rainforest you can't really see that border, right? So this is deep, dense rainforest, and the Bofi technically live on this side of it, and the Aka, some of the Aka live on this side of it, but the Aka that I studied lived on the other side of the border. But in terms of a cultural area, it's a pretty small cultural area we're talking about here. And to give you some background on what sort of their lifeways are, I'm not sure if it's hard to see the pictures or if maybe the light's coming down a little bit would be easier to see. But anyways, the Bofi and the Aka foragers are, should I say something? Can we get the lights down a little bit because the pictures are sort of dark? So the Bofi and the Aka are semi-nomadic foragers or hunter-gatherers, and that just means that part of the year they live in one area and part of the year they move around. And on the left here is a picture of the forest camp, and so they have a temporary dome house that families build, and they may live in this house for a few weeks or a few months, depending on the food sources and how things are going with, depending on the season with if it's a hunting camp with the hunting, or if it's for caterpillars, depending on this, but they basically are following the food sources. And then part of the year, they live on the outskirts. This is, you can see it's a drier area because it's been cleared. So these are semi-permanent camps on the outskirts of farming villages, and you can see the structures of the houses are a little more semi-permanent. And so part of the year they live on the outskirts of the villages where the farmers live, trading forest for farm goods, and part of the year following food sources in the rainforest. And you can see here is a net. So the Bofi and the Aka are considered cooperative net hunters, and this means that they do not hunt only in small families or individually. They hunt in large groups. So usually about 8 to 10 families go out together, and each family sets up a very large net, and they cover about the size of about half a football field in the dense rainforest. And typically women guard the nets, as this woman right here who's breastfeeding is doing. And typically men go into sort of the center of the semicircle. Most of this you can't see, so they are, so this happens, this is orchestrated, there we go. This is orchestrated auditorily because you can't really always see each other very well. But the men and the boys typically go into the center and have spears and are generally making noise to scare up nocturnal animals to hopefully towards the nets. That's the key thing here, hopefully towards the nets. And then as an animal hits the net does not keep the animal for very long, and so the women's typical role is this woman would set down her baby on the forest floor and would go over and tackle the animal, pick it up, bonk its head over on a tree or with a machete. So women and men are both very physically involved in hunting. This is, if you know many things about hunter-gatherers, you may have heard old images of man the hunter. This is not at all what the Aka and Bofi foragers are like. This is a very much family cooperative kind of subsistence pattern. And children are also intricately involved in it also. And as children are carried along on the net hunts, like this child who's about 12 months, once children get too heavy or are weaned, they will be left in camp. But then once they are tall enough and strong enough to keep up with the family, which is usually around 7 or 8, they'll continue and also help on the net hunts as well. So lots of people involved. So in terms of child care and child rearing, you can see that this is an environment in which young children and infants have exposure to many different caregivers and are involved in many aspects of the subsistence of the group. So couples do also gather together. So children are usually around, often around both parents. There is some gendered division of labor, as I talked about, with the men being more likely to scare up the animals and the women being more likely to guard the net and kill the animal. But there is also quite a bit of flexibility. Men and women make relatively balanced contributions to child care, and the Aka and Bofi foragers are both well known for their very extensive patterns of cooperative caregiving. The Aka especially are well known for their high father involvement. The Bofi foragers, so Barry Hewlett's work looking at the Aka infants and my work looking at Bofi forager toddlers and their fathers also shows continuity with that fathers are remarkably highly involved in these particular contexts. In terms of some of the core cultural values that you need to know about the Aka and Bofi to really understand their behaviors and what might be guiding some of these practices or supporting some of these practices, is they're strongly egalitarian. Now, I don't know if it's possible for any community to be perfectly, purely egalitarian, but that's probably a whole nother talk. But they do value egalitarianism, both in gender and age. So this means that older people are not afforded and given higher access to resources and power and privilege than younger individuals, even when you're talking about young children. So if a young child decides to pick on an elder, that elder could ignore the child, walk away, but nobody is going to punitively deal with a child doing that because the child is given respect for their personal autonomy, although you would rarely see something like that in this community. They also value and demand extensive sharing. So this is both in cooperative caregiving, but also in terms of material objects, that objects are not seen as permanently owned by anyone, and that everyone is seen as being responsible. There's been a lot of work on the sensitivity and responsiveness to infant and toddler cues, and one of the things when I'm out with the Aka and Bofi that you hear a lot, if you hear a baby cry, which isn't really that often, but if you do, you all of a sudden hear people shouting out, pick up the child, pick up the child, pick up the child. People from all over, they don't know whose child it is, they might not see it, but they're telling people, pick up the child. Because someone who's there, baboom, baboom, should pick up the child. Because a child should not be left to cry, because crying is thought to cause a child to become ill and perhaps die. So there's this extensive sharing, but the sharing is not just for material objects, it's also for caregiving as well. And there's this high degree of respect for personal autonomy. So even though there are these large cooperative and shared experiences and encouragement of helping others out, nobody is overtly punished for not participating in anything. And there are many days where couples or people don't go on the net hunts, and they still eat all the food. And there's a lot of trading off in terms of that. So just in terms of some of the demographics, on average, women give birth to about 6 children in their lifetime, and there are extremely high mortality rates. About 40% of Aka and Bofi forager children live to reproductive age, so you have quite high mortality rates as well. Okay, it's probably a lot of ethnographic. That's what trips me up with time is the ethnographic background. So, okay, so I'm gonna just zip right over because this is just the sample we're looking at here. Between 1.5 and 4 years of age, about a third of the children mothers were pregnant, about a quarter had a new infant sibling, and about 41% here had a mother who was not pregnant and also did not have an infant sibling. We have about half girls and about 45% firstborn children. And it's a little higher than the community averages, but there were 81% of this sample were monogamous, although for the entire community they only have about a 10% polygyny rate, and it's very fluid. The polygynous marriages seem to not always last very long because of if a husband takes on another wife, the first wife may or might not agree with that, and because gender is so gender egalitarianism that oftentimes this dissolves marriages or changes them. So you have fairly low polygyny rates. Okay, in terms of this first question about cultural models of transitions to older siblinghood, looking at some of the qualitative data, one of the biggest themes that came out talking to parents is that the parents aren't really doing much about sibling transitions, that it's really the children who guide their experiences, in short. So parents oftentimes talked about, in terms of pregnancy, mothers spoke of, well, when my belly was growing big, the child saw this and this scared them, and so they didn't want to be around me anymore. So the mother wasn't saying, I stopped holding them or stopped doing these things or decreased because the other baby was coming. They interpreted it all as being led by the younger child themselves. Some few parents did remark that children were happy about the new baby, but this was more rare. Parents, mothers, and fathers, there was a strong depiction of the sibling transition time as being a time of danger and fear for the child. Mothers explained often that, and fathers too, that pregnancy causes breast milk to go bad, and that this breast milk during pregnancy will make the children sick. And so this oftentimes precipitated sometimes subtle and sometimes less subtle weaning practices. And so this bad milk, because of pregnancy, would cause the children to stop nursing. But then they also talked about how the baby in the womb was themselves acting upon the other child, causing the other child to be scared. And I remember doing one interview, and a mother was demonstrating and showing me how when she would have been pregnant, this is afterwards, she'd been pregnant and the child was very restless one day, the baby in her belly was very restless one day and kicked. And as the foot protruded from the belly, she said, my other child was nearby and they touched each other. And she's like, and that very day, he had diarrhea and he almost died. So she was associating, the meaning given to this association was that it's dangerous, this new child is dangerous for the other child. That even the touching was related to her interpretation of a disease that her then younger child came. And so there's this idea that children move away from the mother because of these dangers, and that they're generally scared of the belly, and more parents reported that children are scared of the new infant as well. Mothers and fathers also talked about the importance of fathers and grandmothers in terms of helping the young child who has recently become an older sibling. Many mothers, even though most families co-slept in one family bed, many mothers talked about and fathers talked about how the father made another bed so that he could sleep with the young child who didn't want to be near the new baby, and how this was helpful for that young child. And other parents talked about how the toddler-age child, who was no longer the youngest, went to sleep at their grandmother's house, and how the grandmothers providing that extra nighttime care was helpful. So co-sleeping was a big thing they talked about in terms of that cooperative care, specifically during this transition time. I better speed it up if I'm going to get through this. Does pregnancy and the arrival go along with a shift in caregiving experiences? And so I looked again at mothers and fathers, and then I've grouped adult alloparents together, but this is mostly grandmothers and aunts. And then I'm looking at child alloparents at these three different stages of sibling transition. And then just as a first attempt, I'm looking at the vocal interactions that children had with these different caregivers in terms of the caregiver talking to the child, essentially holding the child physically, which means in the arm or in a lap, or being just in close proximity within a foot of the child observed. And in each of the analysis that I'm going to present, I looked at children's age, because we know age has a lot to do with these things, and sibling transition stage, which is, again, the mothers were not pregnant, the mothers were pregnant, or they had a new infant sibling, and then the birth order of the child, because presumably firstborns are going through a more dramatic transition. And I did preliminarily divide ACA and BOFI up to see if there were differences, and there weren't, and gender, so I've dropped those from what I'm about to show you because there weren't any gender or cultural group differences here. So in terms of the maternal involvement, I'll show you a graph rather than keep these numbers up here, but in short, there were both effects for children's age and sibling transition for all three of the behaviors I was looking at, and no birth order effects. And so looking at mother vocalizations, you can see by age, mothers talk to 3- and 4-year-olds less than they talk to 1- and 2-year-olds, not a huge surprise. And looking at sibling transition stage, also predicted vocalizing, mothers vocalizing, although the difference is only significant between the children whose mothers were not pregnant and those that had an infant sibling. So, but again, the same trend in the same direction. And if we look at mother holding, we see a more dramatic shift for age, with the 3- and 4-year-olds being held a lot less, which isn't a big surprise since they have a lot more capabilities and needs than 1- to 2-year-olds. And I should also note that there were no interaction effects between age and sibling transition stage either. But that if you look at sibling transition and holding, there's a clear difference here between each stage. Although this is, again, cross-sectional data, there's a remarkably different pattern of physical care that they're receiving from mothers. And close proximity, same trend as with holding, and similar trend for sibling transition stage in that the difference between children whose mothers were not pregnant and had a new infant sibling, their mothers were not near them far as much as the mothers who were not pregnant. I'm trying to speed up, sorry, here. So if we look at paternal involvement, there were no sibling transition effects or age effects, but there were birth order effects. And you can see here that father holding, there was a bump they were more likely to be held if they were later born children versus firstborn, and the same thing for proximity versus firstborn. And what's interesting about this, to make this brief, is that the effects for the grandmothers and the aunts were exactly the opposite as the fathers. Only birth order mattered, and it was exactly in the opposite direction in that grandmothers and aunts are more likely to be helping the firstborn children and less, so there seems to be some relationship there between father involvement and the grandmother-aunt involvement. Looking at child caregivers and social partners, birth order and sibling transition effects were both identified, but only for proximity. So in terms of who they were observed being within 1 foot of. So the children who were later born children, and this is driven probably by the fact that they had older siblings, were more likely to be observed in the presence of other siblings. So that can be explained mostly by having older siblings, although the firstborn children were not in a child-deprived environment because they live in very tightly knit communities, and there were no differences between first and born in terms of how many children were in the camp in which they were observed. There was just a difference in the number of siblings they had. And then for proximity also, there's a large difference in terms of children who had an infant sibling were much more likely, excluding that infant sibling, were much more likely to be observed in close proximity to other children than were children whose mothers were either not pregnant or were pregnant. So there does seem to be a caregiving transition there as well. In terms of looking at children's behavior, the only effect that I found was for the actual sibling transition phase, not for age, which you might expect to find for fussing and crying and smiling and laughing, but there was no effect in the frequencies there. But the sibling transition phase did predict levels of fussing and crying observed and their play behavior, but I've included play very broadly in terms of both solitary as well as social play, rather than parsing it out. So, however, though, this is not in line with what we would predict if we were predicting high stress or conflict, whether it's from the more developmental perspective or from the neo-evolutionary. You would expect there to be more conflict-related behaviors like fussing and crying, which isn't the only proxy, obviously, for conflict. You would expect there to be higher amounts here, but instead we're seeing that if you have an infant sibling, there's less of that going on than if your mother is pregnant. But for play, actually, having a pregnant mother, those children had lower levels of play, and this is percent of observation. So children, this is one of the most frequent things children are observed doing. Unsurprisingly, children play a lot. So if you look here, the children whose mothers were not pregnant, about 50% of daylight hours, they're playing, either solitary or social play. But that's more than a 10% decrease here in mothers who are pregnant. They're playing a lot less. You know, this is new exploratory data, but it leads me to believe there might be something going on here during pregnancy more so than during the reaction to a child if you see play being a little bit depressed at that level. So this is something that I want to further explore. Okay, in summary, from this preliminary look at my data in Central African Republic and Congo, I don't think it's safe to assume that the transition to becoming an older sibling is always stressful or conflict, but that especially because the fussing and crying was less frequent through those subsequent stages. However, seems to be something going on with the less frequent play, especially when mothers are pregnant. And I think it's important to consider cultural perspectives here as well, because in the interviews, the Bofi and Aka parents did talk about how pregnancy was the time when that was most fearful for children. And so it could be that there is some fear about why the mother's belly is growing that could be related to these lower levels of play. And it also suggests to me that looking at sibling transition from the arrival of the new sibling may be a little bit late, but that something going on with pregnancy might be a better or more sensitive time to look at some of these changes. Interestingly, there was relative stability of father involvement if we were talking about sibling transition stage, and this is consistent with the developmental research looking at stable father involvement. And the non-parental adults, which are mostly grandmothers and aunts, showing especially high with the firstborns, who may also presumably be more upset by the transition. This may be something potentially that's potentially lessening the conflict around the transition. But essentially what I would really like all of you to walk away with is that looking at any sort of phenomena that is complex like this, that it's really important that we consider not just developmental or not just cultural or not just biological, but that we consider integrative transdisciplinary perspectives, because there are a lot going into all of these aspects that by only working within our sort of toolkit we miss. And it's tricky to have a skill set to consider multiple variables, but I think conferences like this can really facilitate the value of what happens when psychologists and anthropologists and family scientists and clinicians talk with each other and really start looking at how issues can be addressed from these multiple perspectives. And I have lots of people to thank, but most of this research was funded partially when I was, part of this research was funded when I was a postdoc at NICHD. There's also been some funding I've received from my university, and lots of help from my collaborators and mentors on this project, and some grad students helped me putting together some of the data and literature for this presentation. But I'm mostly grateful to the Aka and Bofi Forager communities who allowed me to actually be with them and to talk with them and to observe them even when it was probably tedious for those long hours. So thank you very much. Okay.
Excuse me. I think it's interesting to point out that in the United States, there are very few kids anymore that have access to their grandparents or their fathers being around all day long, and aunts
Right.
and so on. In the Aka and Buafi tribes, they're in the community all the time, right?
Right.
So it's a nice buffer for any kind of stress. And the
Right.
kids today in the U.S. have very few buffers anymore, right? Just wondering if you could say anything about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, I think that could be, especially when we were, some of the presentations earlier today and yesterday looking at child stress, and even when we talk about community in the U.S., we're not talking about this kind of intensity of relational community and access to people. And was it Dr. Perry yesterday who he was talking about that U.S. children are relationally deprived. And when I was thinking about that, I mean, it really hits home. And that's why I put up so many pictures, is because I can tell you a lot that fathers are really involved and mothers are really involved, but sometimes seeing, and even in the pictures, seeing how when you saw pictures, I didn't tell them scooch together so I can take your picture, right? The common cultural practice is to be sitting all over each other and to be close and physically and touching, and to not just be living in these small communities, but to be up close and personal with lots of people and have lots of relationships. So it does create this it makes it easier to consider all those people when you're looking at issues like this. But it also, to me, it actually makes it, so it makes it not as much of a surprise that I didn't find a lot of conflict, but that I did find even some lower play is surprising, makes me think that there could actually be something going on in terms of sibling competition there, because with all the protective factors, you wouldn't expect that. Although you have all those protective community factors, you have a much more high-risk environment, in that a decrease in investment could have much more dire consequences to a child in that environment than in an environment where mortality rates are very low. So, yeah, I don't know if I really answered. Yes?
As a long-time La Leche League leader, I was struck by the fact that this fear the mothers had about breastfeeding during their pregnancy probably could it have contributed to the high infant mortality rate? If these mothers are weaning their older child when they're pregnant, I'm sure that I tandem nurse, so I know that, that has a lot of protective factors to even nurse through a pregnancy and beyond. Mm-hmm. The one I nursed would not wean, and I realized later it was because he had such severe asthma, which didn't really manifest until he did wean. So I just wondered if you could comment on that.
So you're wondering if the Aka and Bofi mortality rates might be related to the weaning during pregnancy? Is that what you're asking?
I'm wondering.
Well, one thing I should have mentioned, and I think I just skipped over it, is that even though they're weaning, they're between 3 and 5 years of age, the children we're talking about, and so they're eating a full range of adult foods, and they have been for a long time, so what they're losing breastfeeding-wise isn't huge, although among many populations in non-industrialized contexts, you do tend to see a little spike in mortality right around weaning age, and you see weanling diarrhea because there does seem to be, this does seem to be a more vulnerable risk period for infants, but I mean, I can't tell you if that's driving the mortality rate. I would be shocked if that alone was. I think it's probably driving it as much as it drives it in any population that it doesn't have a lot of exposure to Western-style healthcare and weans at that particular time. But truly, the highest mortality risk is really that first year. Most children, if they make it past the first year, are doing pretty well. And then there's a little bit of a higher risk right around weaning, but it's very low compared to that first year. And then it continues to decrease, and so it's typical. So, yes.
Do you think in the U.S., do you think the older child really has a negative experience when the younger sibling is born, or is that kind of our cultural assumption? And I've seen people say to kids, "Oh, look, your mom's going to have another baby. You're going to," saying something negative to the child, like you're going to have a hard time, or how are you going to do with that? And
well, I thought about that, and I had to restrain myself from not including this in my presentation because I just felt like it was getting too long. But just like a few days before I came here on Facebook, there was a meme going around that it was something like pictures of children who are absolutely destroyed by the idea that they're having. And these aren't children who actually know. They were children of like 1 and 2 year olds in cribs with a sign next to them saying, eviction notice in 9 months, things like that. And they have a picture of the child screaming because it is this cultural idea, in my sense. This is not from my research, but my sense is that there is a strong cultural idea that children are going to be traumatized by this, and that they're not going to like it, and that's a big displacement.
Yeah.
So I don't really know how we tease apart that from their actual experiences, because culture, parents even talking to the child, the ways you talk to it will affect how they actually experience it. Especially with older children who may really be sensitive to the nuances of how the parents frame the arrival of the new child. So I don't really know how to tease apart, because I think it's just a part of that process. But it's a great question.
There are so many resonances with the way we use childcare now. I have a dislike of the phrase, "it takes a village to raise a child." I would much rather we said it takes a village to help a mother to raise a child. And the other thing is that, yes, the village are all helping to raise the child. The child knows everyone in the village, and if the first carer isn't good enough, it'll get passed up the hierarchy until it gets to mum, if that's the only person who will do.
Right, and I think that's a great point. So it's not, the cooperative care isn't just what the child receives in terms of this person holding and giving food or whatever, but also in terms of the extensiveness of sharing of food, for instance, so that mothers and fathers are not the ones that are solely responsible for nourishing their family because of the cooperative nature of the net hunts, that they bring back and share the food extensively also means that what you're saying in terms of that takes a village to raise a mother, too, is that there isn't that same amount of pressure on parents, because it's not just the direct care that they're getting help with, but it's also this instrumental help they're getting as well.
Yes, I think there's just a general feeling that the West, we would like to think that a whole village could do it. There doesn't need to be one primary attachment figure.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.